Today I'm going to be talking about the Finca Paso Seco, transnational interfaith Quaker response to the Jewish refugee question in Cuba, 1939. 15 kilometers south of Havana, Cuba, stars light up the silent sky. It's 1939 and the dark night's breeze blows away the dusty remains of the taxing daytime work. Open air blows into windowless shops and bougainvilleas cover the walls of the small town of Calabasas. Just down the road, beyond a dirt path of 2 miles in length, sits a 35-acre farm. It's an empty upper-class estate long since vacated by its owner, given new life by a crowd previously alien to this environment. Leased by the Quaker American Friends Service Committee, financed by the Jewish Distribution Council, and approved by the Cuban government, this is a home to Jewish refugees from Central Europe who wait for transit to the United States. The operation is called Finca Paso Seco, Dry Path Farm. One of the only transit countries outside of Europe, Cuba is host to thousands of refugees. For much of the 1930s, Franz Blumenstein was the owner and operator of a successful perfume business in Vienna, Austria. His life and the life of millions of others changed November 1938. Because of his Jewish heritage, his shop window was smashed and his business taken away on a night now known as Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. Shortly afterward, Blumenstein left his home in Vienna in search of safety. Only able to procure a ticket for himself, he landed in Cuba without his wife or child, jobless and out of money. The situation Blumenstein faced is not unique among the population of European Jews that fled. In reality, prior Nazi expansion like Anschluss led to rapid growth of the refugee situation caused by the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. Attempts to find refuge were not immune to big failures. One of the most notorious failures is the case of the MS St. Louis, a passenger ship that sailed from Hamburg in 1939 with over 100 refugees, only to return to Europe with nearly all of the same passengers. When the St. Louis came ashore in Havana, an excited Franz Blumenstein rowed out in a single-occupancy boat, shouted words of welcome to his wife and son. When the ship departed with its rejected passengers still aboard after oscillating between Miami and the United States for the better part of a week, it was the last time that Blumenstein had seen his wife's face. Despite the St. Louis and other humanitarian disasters, the response to the refugee crisis remains an issue in need of examination because of the implications it has in regard to its status as a crucible of transnational, interfaith, and international interaction. One example is the work of the American Friends Service Committee at the Finca Paso Seco. This paper will examine the way the AFSC approached relief work in Cuba during the refugee crisis at the outset of World War II. It will argue that non-governmental humanitarian organizations made an impact because they operated with enough autonomy from government to be able to work transnationally, while still able to advance humanitarian interests that benefited local governments and refugees. So the four main actors in this are the AFSC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, Cuba, and the United States. The AFSC had much experience working with Germany after World War I. They sent a Quaker feeding program to go help the post-war Germans, and through that, actually, some refugees, even before, had come to work and live with the Quakers in Pennsylvania. One of them, Hertha Kraus, becomes central to this operation in which she can work with refugees in Germany, and she works with the AFSC. She links the two organizations and helps to settle the refugees. At the time, Cuba's going through governmental issues. It's just barely beginning to get its find out how to rule itself after being dominated by the United States for the past quarter century. And inside the United States, it's what historian David Wyman has called Nativist Nationalism. The United States is very skeptical about admitting any Jewish refugees. So the Quakers get together and set up the Finca Paso Seco. It was a cooperative effort established by the AFSC and the JDC. The JDC gave funding to the AFSC because they trusted the good work that they'd done in the past. Herta Kraus finds a location, this old gentleman's estate that she can rent out for the AFSC to do a small, about 50 people relief operation. There had been bigger plans. They wanted to use the Isle of Pines, but there was a conflict over, who had the rights to the Isle of Pines, who was going to fund it. So they found something ultimately that was a little smaller, a little closer to Havana, and a little more doable from this operation that had a base in Philadelphia, people coming from Europe. It was actually existing in Cuba. So the AFSC sought to send experts to this place that had the ability to make a big impact. So, towering at 6 feet 6 inches tall, he's actually the one sitting down in this picture, is Emmett Goley. He's a farmer who comes from the Midwest with a prolific career in service for the AFSC. He'd lived in Mexico, Palestine, Spain, and now Cuba, so he was fluent in Spanish, and he had a lot of experience working in times of conflict abroad. He had an immediate impact. Due to his ability to promote the cause, make successful relationships with a variety of people locally and abroad, the Finca was pretty successful from its get-go. In a German weekly magazine, Goley's described to have earned the respect and won the hearts of everyone at the Finca. They explain he has an attentive character, embracing kindness, and understanding the joys and suffering were praised from all sides going through this difficult situation. Frank Rice, another Quaker working at the Finca, there were 4 of them, with Emmett Goley, praised him by saying he had a lot of practical ability, which was necessary in Cuba at the time. Furthermore, he was happy dealing with other people, and his command of Spanish was truly amazing, Rice said. He had respect and admiration of everyone here. Life at the camp was clearly not something that the United States or Cuban governments were willing to set up. It was something that took a lot of funding, a lot of time, and a lot of effort, a lot of know-how, at a time when these governments had other things on their mind. For the United States, the fear of Jewish immigrants kept many sidelined. For Cuba, not necessarily a fear of Jewish immigrants, but a lack of perhaps ability to deal with the never-ending flood of people trying to get into the country. A typical day at the Finca included a 6:30 wake-up, a breakfast coffee, and a banana and some bread. They packed the days with activities between 2 meals, and they thought doing these activities would prevent them from becoming the restless refugees in the rest of Cuba. At the time, there's about 6,000 refugees. In the afternoon, 3 classes that are taught, and the residents are taught everything from American history to Spanish. Some guests wanted to learn English more. Some had their mind focused on getting to the United States. Some had family in the United States. Others didn't know what was going to happen. Some thought that they would eventually be able to go back to their home in Central Europe. So the reactions are vary greatly between person and person. To showcase the work that was done, open house events were set up to make the work known on a wider scale. Visitors such as the mayor of Calabasas noticed that growing bananas and camaraderie of the residents playing music went beyond national and cultural boundaries. Another important guest who enjoyed this was the American consul, who enjoyed a musical program that highlighted performances on a piano, violin, and chorus. The chorus of Jewish refugees sang an African-American spiritual to the delight of the visitors, in one case. One of the reasons this story is so interesting is because of the transnational interactions. The impacts made by the AFSC and the refugees were atypical of interactions that had occurred previously between people essentially representing the United States and Cuba in an official capacity. Previously, the U.S. had been involved largely in economic pursuits or religious pursuits that greatly aided the economic pursuits. After all, Batista was educated at the Friends School in Banes, which was essentially a school that prepped people for work at the United Fruit. For the Cuban people, the refugees served both to fascinate and frustrate. Edmundo Desnos captures the experience in his novel as he comes to terms with the mixed feelings, knowing that the Holocaust led to the death of millions, but the introduction to his future wife. His wife writes from the other perspective, fictionalizing the strange feelings of moving from a homogeneous world in Europe to the vibrant diversity of Cuba. There were new connections that went beyond person to person, that transcended the racial and interfaith boundaries. Emmett Goley, in his writings, explains that the rabbi would come from Havana to help with the refugees, which is interesting because the Jewish population, and there was a significant one, was mostly Eastern European Jews. So the linguistic and cultural connections, even between the Jews from Central Europe and Eastern Europe, were areas of growing pains, and really illustrate how enormous of a task this was to have so many different people coming to this refugee camp, trying to work out a solution to a problem that only seemed to get worse. As war started at an ever-quickening pace later in 1939, the flood of refugees to the west turned into a trickle, and eventually hardly anything at all as war picked up. The Finca continued to work with the displaced Jews in Cuba until 1941. But by then, they'd helped hundreds to get permanent residences in locations all around North and South America. When the Finca closed, a small success made possible by the hard work of people from Cuba, United States, and Central Europe was finished. Franz Blumenstein searched frantically for his wife and child when he was at the Finca. Eventually, he located them in a house in Netherlands with the help of the Quakers in Philadelphia. When he was approved for immigration to the Jewish refugee colony at Sosua, Dominican Republic, his son joined him. After years of difficult farm work in the Caribbean, he and his son went to start a new life in the United States. Ultimately, the humanitarian practices and projects that the AFSC embarked on during the 20th century offer new insight to the way that NGOs worked in a fastly growing transnational space. There is little doubt the United States' response to the refugee situation was a disaster, as May Nye writes critically of the failure of the United States to respond to people fleeing fascism, and cites that the U.S. might have only taken 250,000 when there were nearly 8 million displaced persons at the end of the war. The operation of the Finca was small, but illustrates a model of humanitarian work that allowed government to maintain political dispositions while also actually helping succeeding to help those in need. In the introduction to the 1939 annual report for the American Friends Service Committee, the chairman, Rufus Jones, references The Red Room, a story written by H.G. Wells in which a young man attempts to prove that a house is not haunted. However, when a row of burning candles begins to extinguish themselves one by one, the hero is eventually left frightened in a dark room. Jones goes on to compare the 1939 to the story, a year crowded with mysteries enough, while the world watched light after light go out. However, Jones continues to argue that love still lasts on and remains the greatest thing in the world. The way of love is also the way of faith and hope, he writes, and it will in the end prove the way of peace. The AFSC story was, as Jones suggested, a story of love and action and light in a dark house.